Have you ever wondered if it's possible to give speech back to those who've lost it by using advanced brain technology? Dear listeners, welcome to the episode 83 of our Neurocareers Doing the Impossible podcast, where we are diving deep into the world of speech neuroprostheses and exploring how brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs, are unlocking new ways to communicate. Speech decoding BCIs are gaining ground rapidly. They promise a new way to communicate for those who cannot speak by tapping directly into brain activity. The secret to making these devices work lies in understanding how speech is produced in the brain, from the timing to the specific brain regions involved. Interestingly, it looks like even deeper brain areas, including insula, hippocampus, and thalamus, are involved in this process. I'm your podcast host, Dr. Milena Korostenskaya, or simply Dr. K. And joining us today is Maxime Verwoert, a researcher with the long-term goal to develop speech neuroprostheses. After her studies in psychology and neuroscience at Utrecht University, Maxime is now a PhD candidate at Maastricht University in Netherlands, focusing on decoding speech signals in real time with stereo EEG. This technology is less invasive than other methods such as electrocorticography, offering hope for long-term use in BCIs. Maxime's recent work, published in Nature Scientific Data, involved collecting a rich data set from participants reading aloud while their brain activity was meticulously recorded. This data set covers a broad spectrum of brain regions and offers deep insights into how we produce speech. In our chat, Maxime will break down how this cutting-edge technology is developed, the hurdles of interpreting complex brain signals into speech, and what the future holds for people needing speech neuroprosthesis. Maxime will also share her advice for those planning to get into the field of neurotechnologies. Whether you are a technology enthusiast, a healthcare professional, or just curious about how neuroscience is changing lives, this conversation promises to bring unique knowledge and inspiration. So tune in and get ready to be amazed and inspired. Hello, Maxime. It's so wonderful to see you today in our podcast. Can you please introduce yourself to our listeners and let us know where you are joining us from what part of the world?
Yes, I am joining you from Linz in Austria, but I did my PhD at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. So I'm actually at the Neural Interfacing Lab that's led by Christian Herf and Peter Kubben. And we really focus on speech decoding. And my project is also part of the consortium called INTENSE, and that stands for the Innovative Neurotechnology for Society. And my project is part of the work package for paralysis. So we work on speech, but also motor decoding. And in the consortium, there's actually other work packages too, looking into blindness, deafness, and epilepsy as well. But I focus on speech decoding, in particular with stereo, electroencephalography.
Very, very interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about your university? What Maastricht University is known for, where is located, maybe some interesting facts about it?
Yeah, so I didn't really study at Maastricht University, so I don't know a whole lot, but it's in the south of the Netherlands, all the way in the south. So it's very far from the rest of the Netherlands, and it's actually surrounded by 3 other countries. So that's an interesting fact. There's Belgium, Germany, and also Luxembourg, kind of very close to Maastricht. So it's a very international university.
Thank you. Now, tell us, please, how did you get into this field of speech decoding? Yes, neurotechnologies, neuroscience, how all this interest evolved in you, and how did you get to do such wonderful research?
Yeah, it's a relatively long story now, not really. So I guess it started with going to university. So I studied at Utrecht University, and I started with psychology. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do at that point yet, but at least the brain and behavior sounded super interesting to me. So I went into psychology, and then I found out that I was really interested in neurobiology. So you had to kind of in the second year already go into some direction. So I chose the neurobiological psychology because I was really intrigued on how does everything actually work out there. There, I learned a lot already about neuroscience as well. And then I went into the research master, neuroscience and cognition, cognitive neuroscience. And that really prepared me well for kind of life in academia. I also took an internship abroad in Helsinki in Finland, did an fMRI project. Already on speech, actually, it was an audiovisual attention during conversation, during a natural conversation. So that got me a little bit into the direction already. But after my master's, I still didn't know what I really wanted to do because there's so much, right? So many different topics and directions you can go in. I wanted to learn more and explore a bit. So I took a research assistant position at the BCI group in Utrecht, which is at the University Hospital, led by Dr. Nick Ramsey. And they were doing BCIs. And I was basically the flow manager there. So I was involved in many, many different projects, almost all the projects that they were doing. So I got to know a lot more about fMRI, also about electrocorticography, also sEEG at that time a little bit. Yeah, so that's how I kind of got my interest into the field. And after 2 years of that, I decided it was time to get that PhD. And that's how I ended up at Maastricht.
And how did you get specifically into that program at Maastricht University? How did you choose it? Did you already know that you will be working with speech decoding or similar research? So how did that happen?
Yeah, it's luck because at the time, so I got a lot of knowledge about BCIs, and I knew that I wanted to go into that direction, at least neurotechnologies. The topic itself didn't really matter too much to me. I just wanted to do anything really. So I spoke to Nick Ramsey about it, about my desire to do the PhD, and he didn't have any positions at the time, but he was setting up this consortium that I told you about, the Intense Consortium. He is actually the work package leader. So he actually knew that there was a position coming up in Maastricht with Christian and Peter. So he told me about it. He told them about it. We connected, got an interview, and that's how it happened.
Yes, so a lot of networking, yes, in your case.
Yes, networking. Yeah, very important. very helpful.
Yes, absolutely. So it's a great advice to those of our listeners who are looking for this type of positions. Okay, so now let's talk about your topic, about this research that you are doing. And actually, maybe before that, because I got so interested in that in intense consortium, can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because it seems like a very interesting and important initiative. What is it? What projects? What are the goals of this consortium? And how is your work contributing to the work that is done by consortium?
So it's a relatively large consortium, mostly a lot of labs in the Netherlands. There's also some companies involved. Yeah, so we focus on these 4 different fields of research for BCIs, basically, or neurotechnology. So my part is for the paralysis, is to really help people that have lost the ability to move, to help them move again or communicate again for the speech part. There's a lot of research going on also in the visual domain. So especially the researchers in Amsterdam, they really focus on visual prosthetics. So they do a lot of animal research as well, developing loads of tech in collaboration with many different partners. There is, of course, the cochlear implants for deafness. Then we have also the epilepsy part. I guess they are more focusing on stimulation devices that could help epilepsy, but I don't know all the details about that work. Yeah, it's a project that's pretty long. I think it's 7 years in total. And I guess the ultimate goal is to really develop these technologies for society.
Yes, that's an amazing initiative, and it's very good for those who are interested in BCIs in Netherlands to know that it exists and maybe even to become a part of it. Now let's talk specifically about your project. So what are you developing? Where did you start? And where are you now? At what stage of the project?
Yeah, so I came into the lab and they were already focused on speech decoding. They already were working with closed loop speech BCI. There was a paper on that. They showed that we are able to use stereo electroencephalography to basically reconstruct speech in real time. This is kind of where I came into the lab. The problem, though, is that BCI or framework is not open source. So we set off on this journey to basically develop and continuously test our own speech BCI framework. So that's been a big process these last few years. We wanted to develop one because our group is growing and we needed something that's flexible and fully open source and that we can easily adapt to new models or new analyses and things like that. So yeah, that's where we still are into the development and testing of this BCI. And in the meantime, while we're doing that, it's mostly just recording a lot of data with our participants and analyzing them offline as well.
You already mentioned several things that maybe we can clarify a little bit for our listeners, especially those who are just getting into the field. For example, what are closed loop speech BCIs?
So closed loop speech BCI, with closed loop, we mean it is really a system that's producing outputs or feedback in real time. So that means it's taking in as input the neural data, applying algorithms, and then outputting some form of feedback. And that could be, for a speech BCI, it could be a text on the screen. And what we're doing is more of an audio reconstruction. So what you get as feedback is an auditory sound that should then represent what the person is thinking or trying to say.
Thank you so much. And you also mentioned that you are using stereo EEG for your recordings. So what is stereo EEG and how is different from other recording types that other groups are doing for closed-loop speech BCIs?
Stereo EEG, or sEEG for short, is a method that was already developed, I think, in the 1950s by Bonnecourt and Talleyrand in France, I believe. But it's only gotten popular in the last decade or so for epilepsy monitoring. So they're basically electrodes that are like very thin rods or needles, and they are implanted in patients suffering from drug-resistant epilepsy. It's kind of a last resort to figure out where the epilepsy is originating, and then deactivating that region so they can be seizure-free. Similar to electrocorticography or ECOG, they also use that method for epilepsy monitoring. The difference is that in sEEG, the electrodes are implanted deep into the brain, and usually there are many different electrodes implanted at once. So typically there are around 10 of these electrodes implanted into different areas of the brain. So that's an advantage of sEEG. You can kind of target multiple segregated regions. And where they are targeted depends on the hypothesis the neurologist has on where the epilepsy might be coming from. As opposed to ECOG, you would be placing a grid of electrodes on the cortical surface. And usually that's just in one or a few specific areas on the cortical surface. So with that, you're not able to target the subcortical areas and also areas within sulci, for example. So you're only getting the cortex, the gyrus. The other thing is with ECOG, you have to do a craniotomy to implant the device. And craniotomy is actually opening up the skull, and that can lead to infections. I think it has a higher risk of infections than with sEEG, because there you would only need very small burr holes into the scalp in order to insert those needles. So in a sense, it's slightly less invasive than the other techniques. And also they don't need to shave the head in order to do this. So that's very nice for women, especially, I would say, people who value their hair. With sEEG, we can also target or measure from white matter tracts. It's still always a question, what are we really measuring? But at least we can get really cool information from that as well.
Yes, absolutely. And in terms of recording the signal of interest that has some information about a person's speech, how the signal is different, ECOG versus sEEG.
I don't think so. The EEG itself doesn't look much different, in my opinion. We typically look at similar features. So for speech decoding, we typically look at the high gamma, or now it's called high broadband, high frequency activity. Cannot say gamma band anymore. So these are typically frequencies between 70 and 170 hertz. At least this is the range that we're using. I think it's similar in ECOG. It's just that what it represents is slightly different. So the ECOG electrodes are typically larger than those of sEEG. So you would think that they would capture a larger population of neurons than in sEEG. And then, of course, the location, where are you measuring from, is very different. So that would, of course, affect what you're measuring. Although in the naked eye, you cannot see a difference, I think.
Very interesting. So now let's get into more details. So what was the goal of your study in speech decoding? What did you want to accomplish?
The goal is really to get a BCI or a speech BCI further to something that's actually useful for a patient. Of course, the method that we're using, sEEG, is relatively new in this domain. So there's a lot of things to figure out and how to analyze this data. So a lot of my projects involve that kind of fundamental work. And then the other goal is to really assess the feasibility of the device and together with my colleagues figure out models to really make it better. I think.
So, with your first goal to look at sEEG, how feasible it is, and how this can be done in general, speech BCI, and you mentioned that it's a relatively new approach. So, what are the current approaches that people are trying to use for speech BCIs? And how is it different from the one that you are using?
There have been major advances in the speech domain in recent years. As you and the listeners might have heard from the previous podcasts, from the BCI award winners and nominees as well. So I think most groups, or some, I can give some examples. So there's Eddie Cheng's lab, Nathan Cron's lab. Both of them are working on electrical corticography, so the ECOG grids on the sensory motor cortex for speech BCIs. Then you have Sergei Stavitsky's lab, who is working with the Utah array. So this is a much smaller array with many needles. Also implanted on sensory motor cortex, I believe. Then we have, I think, Sarah Wandelt from Richard Anderson's lab. She also looked at internal speech decoding in the supramarginal gyrus with the Utah array. So I think those two devices are the main ones being used in the speech BCI domain. Although another cool lab to highlight is that of Alexander Huff. And they have found using fMRI, so that's a non-invasive method, that semantics is the meaning of words, is actually all over the brain. So that's a really interesting finding.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much for this overview. It really gives a perspective. You mentioned that we can have BCIs that are sampling information from sensory motor cortex, or the ones that are looking at the semantics, which is distributed throughout the brain. So which approach are you using in your studies?
So of course I use sEEG, and as I told you before, these electrodes are kind of all over the brain. So I think that's the big difference between our work and previous work. These grids are usually just in one area, right? Sensory motor cortex or supramarginal gyrus. But with sEEG, we can get these brain-wide recordings. And we have typically 128 electrodes in different areas. So that's really cool because we can investigate kind of brain-wide dynamics like in fMRI. So in fMRI, you really have that spatial resolution. The downside in fMRI is that you don't really have the temporal resolution. And of course, speech is very fast. So you might be missing some things there. So I think sEEG has both high temporal and spatial resolution, although the sampling spatially is quite sparse. So we don't have a lot of electrodes in one region, but we do have a lot of electrodes in many different regions. And that allows us to investigate different questions. So maybe there are other areas in the sensory motor cortex or the supramarginal gyrus that are really cool for a speech BCI, for example.
Mm-hmm. So what did you learn? Did you find some other areas apart from sensory motor cortex? And if so, what are those areas?
I think we do, like if we try to really decode speech versus silence, for example, we do see the typical language hubs. So definitely the auditory cortex, superior temporal areas, of course the motor cortex, inferior motor, but also some more parietal regions. A lot of different areas show up. If we look at specifically different kind of features of speech, so in one project I look at the auditory features, so acoustic features. This is kind of what we typically do in our lab, but we can also look at articulatory features, so kind of a motoric representation of speech. And we can look at semantics, like Hutt's work. So we compare these different features or outcomes and we try to decode or encode this. We see that the auditory and motoric domain are very much overlapping in terms of spatial representation. But the semantics, we also see that that's kind of everywhere. So we see kind of similar results in fMRI and now with sEEG, which is pretty cool. Another important finding is that in recent years, there's been a bit of a debate on the Broca's area, inferior frontal gyrus. So Francis Willett also recently had a paper. They had an UTRA on that area and also the, I think, precentral gyrus. And they were able to decode speech really well in the precentral gyrus, but actually pretty much not at all in the Broca's area. And we also don't find a lot of contribution from this region. So that's interesting. And also in our case, though, I think it might be because of the nature of our speech tasks, because we just asked our participants to read words or sentences out loud that's presented visually on the screen. So they're just reading. They don't really have to think about it. They don't really have to plan. They don't really have to generate language on their own. And I think that might be an important reason why this area doesn't really show up in our work.
Very interesting. And in general, as I see, you can look from the perspective of both type of studies, yes, and fMRI, this distribution throughout the brain and specific at sensory motor cortex, yes, what ECOG, for example, or especially those UTRA studies can tell. So sEEG provides this a little bit broader perspective on things, which is, yeah, very interesting approach. Okay, so maybe we can go into the details of your recent study that you did with sEEG and speech decoding. And can you explain how this study was constructed? How did you approach? What were the stimuli that you presented to people? And then we will go even into some more details into the decoding that you've done.
In our lab, we really value open science, and we are a very small group, but we have a lot of cool data. So we think that together with the community, we can make much bigger steps, basically. So this is why we really wanted to publish the data we have. So that's how this paper came about. So we had this data, this speech data lying around, and we're like, yeah, we have to let other people see what this is like. This is kind of the standard task we have with our participants. We basically just ask them to speak 100 words out loud, and we record their neural activity through sEEG, and then also the microphone recordings, because then we have the actually spoken audio of the speech at the same time. So that's the behavior. And then you can do lots of analysis on this data, try different models for decoding, also learning more about speech features. There's a lot you can do with this type of data.
Yes. And what did you do specifically in this type of data? How did you decode the speech and activity, yes, from brain activity associated with it? Maybe you can give us some more details.
Of course, we provided a technical validation of the data sets for publishing. So what we did there is to reconstruct the speech from the neural recordings. So we basically just used a very simple linear regression. We take the high frequency activity of the 70 to 170 hertz. We use that as our features into the model. And basically the model just learns the connection between the neural data and the audio. And then you can use unseen data as a test data. So you just held up part of the data and then see what it comes up with. Basically, that's a simple linear regression. And we see that this works better than trends in pretty much all of the participants. So that's good news. And the model we use, it's a very simple model. So there is a lot of room for improvement there. So we do hope that people that want to work with this data set can also try different models and see what works best.
Thank you. And what is available for people in terms of those data sets? This only sEEG recordings, or they also can have that recorded voice to correlate with the recording? So what is available?
Yeah, so we have the neural recordings and then the audio recordings, and then the stimuli, of course. So the words represented on the screen. So that's just basically a word list. And these 3 data streams, they're already perfectly aligned in the data set. So basically, you just can get started very easily. We also provide the Python code for analyzing the data, so you don't have to start black box. Actually, we just added also MATLAB code for loading the data, because there are some people requesting that. I think Python and MATLAB are the most often used in neuroscience. So yeah, so there's that. There's also anatomical information. So of course we mapped where the electrodes are. So we have the anatomical labels and the locations and the brain. So you can actually plot the results in the patient's brain.
That's amazing. Are you aware of the groups that are already working with this type of data?
Yeah, I think there were a few groups working on it. I also noticed there was a student project published at some point who was working with it. So that's really great, because we really hope that this data set can also be used as a research resource for teaching.
Yeah, that's amazing. And of course, I would like to add all that information about the article, data set, also access to the Python code, the MATLAB into our podcast notes so that our listeners would be able to start working with it. Okay, excellent. So what were the main results of this project, of this particular work, and what were the limitations? What do you think needs to be addressed maybe in the future studies like that?
Yeah, so the goal of this dataset paper is really to publish the data and let people play around with it. So there's just a technical validation, just to show that the data is good, right? You can do stuff with it. The major result is that you can use this data for speech decoding. There is relevant information in this type of neural recordings for speech. Of course, there are many questions still left to answer. There's not a whole lot done, as I said, in this domain for speech. So there's many questions that need to be addressed. In terms of limitations, it might be a lot of people typically use a classification approach for decoding. And this could be a challenge with this data set, because we use 100 unique words rather than a repetition of words or repetition of trials for classification. So that might be a bit difficult, because the approach we use is really a continuous reconstruction. And we are, in that way we do it, we're really agnostic in what kind of speech is actually in there, in the windows that we reconstruct. So that's a bit of a challenge. But the reason for that is that it would make for a lot more flexible BCI and potentially faster as well, because in this way, you don't need a fixed library of a certain amount of words that had to be repeated many different times, for example, as a training data.
Okay, excellent. So, what are your next steps after you already completed this study?
We're still working on our closed loop system, so that's a continuous challenge. Figuring that out, developing, testing it. So hopefully by the end of my PhD, I will have some actual results on that. My colleague just submitted a paper about the new framework and showing a transformer model, and that we're able to use it with a very short delay, less than 20 milliseconds. I think that's a big difference between our framework and that of the other groups, because I think there's a bit bigger delay in the in the other groups. I think it's fast till at the end of a word or at the end of an utterance. So it's a different way of reconstructing the signal. And he showed that we can do this actually on simulated data from the data set. So we're getting there. And now it's just keep on testing it with patients, really. And then I just need to finish up all the projects that I've started. I have like a few different projects lying around that I just told you about, with the semantics, acoustics, articulatory features, and also implant locations. So I just need to finish those up.
Yes. Can you tell maybe a little bit more now about those projects with semantics and articulatory features? What is the current state? What results do you see now? And what are you still planning to do with those?
Yeah, so the goal of that is to really see how these different speech representations are spatially distributed across the brain. So there are different types of speech that you can decode. So another question would be, which one would be best, right? But we're not really focusing on that. We're focusing on the spatial distribution because we do have these brain-wide recordings. So as I told you, like the articulatory and acoustic representation seems to be very much overlapping. So those seem to be really focused in the kind of known language hubs, besides Broca's area in this case. And then the semantic representation seems to be everywhere across the brain. And also we find no real big difference in terms of how strong we can. So our main outcome of performance is a correlation between the original signal or original output and the one that we reconstruct. And we find that this value doesn't really differ much between the two hemispheres. Of course, previously it's thought that the left hemisphere is language dominant. It might still be the case, but at least in the type of analysis we do, we don't see much of a difference between the two hemispheres. So yeah, that's one of the findings as well.
Very interesting. Of course, we will be looking forward to these new developments. What was the most challenging part in all this research that you have been doing, and how did you solve that challenge?
Yeah, it's definitely the development of the closed loop system. I mean, we're a small group, so it takes some time to develop these things. And the other challenge is that we have a limited time with the participants that we record with. So that's actually another big difference between our work and that of the labs that I mentioned before. They typically collect hours of data for training their models, and we really only gather a few minutes. So between 5 and 15 minutes, it's kind of the maximum we get, because we do only have about an hour or less to run this whole speech paradigm, and then another hour for the other tasks that we do in our lab, because we don't do only speech decoding. We do a bunch of cognition, basically. So that's a big challenge, to fit it into the time frame that we have and to test as much as we can. And then there's the technical issues. There is sometimes issues with the participants themselves in trying to explain to them what they're supposed to do. So especially for the closed loop speech, we'd have to instruct them to speak, or to do imagined speech or whispered speech, or lots of different things to try. And sometimes it's a bit hard to bring across these instructions, because the patients also vary in their cognitive abilities. So this is always something we need to adapt to as well as the electrode locations. So this is very important. They are completely different in every single participant, because they are selected very individually. Of course, these regions are targeted based on where their epilepsy might be, and it varies completely. So what we learn from one participant, we cannot really bring to the next. So it's all the time figuring out and training our models on each individual. Yeah, so we also adapt our tasks. So besides the speech, we also adapt our other tasks depending on where the electrodes are located. And another thing is that, they're basically waiting for seizures to occur for about 2 weeks. They're an epilepsy monitoring unit, and they get bored. So when we come in, we do try to like entertain them a little bit. So we try to make it fun. So we do have a lot of tasks that are game-like. So we have the memory game, so turning cards. We have a gambling game. We have a decision-making game, navigation, and we also have one where they move their hand in 3D space, which we record with the leak motion detector. So this is a motor type of task. And they play a game where they catch bubbles with their hands, and their hand is a fish. Just to give an example. So we try to fit those tasks in between the speech task, because the speech task is unfortunately the most boring, because we literally just ask them to speak. All right. We cannot make that a lot more fun. And for the closed loop, some people like it, some people don't. There's also a difference there. So it's continuously having to adapt and being flexible. Yeah, those are some of the main challenges, I think.
Yes, very interesting. And also how you are trying to gamify that data collection, at least for other tasks, is also very interesting to engage participants. What was the most unexpected, the most surprising thing that you discovered during your work on your PhD on this project? Maybe some results that you didn't expect.
I think the most surprising finding was that we find a lot of activity related to speech in the insula. So as you know, with the stereo EEG, we're able to go into sulci, white matters, and usually you cannot really reach the insula, but with stereo EEG you can. And so we were pretty surprised that we saw a lot of electrodes related to speech in that area. So I actually started looking recently into the literature on it, and there have been actually a lot of findings that the insula is implicated in speech already since 1990s, with fMRI, electrical stimulation. I'm surprised by that, because when I look into, overall language or speech production models, I never really noticed that the insula was an important area. So yeah, I was surprised by this.
Very interesting. So, can you a little bit tell our listeners more? First of all, for those who are not familiar with insular, what is it mostly implicated in?
Good question. So first, maybe the anatomy. So the insula is located in the sylvian fissure. So that's very close to the auditory cortex, and also the motor cortex, kind of in between. I think it's involved in a lot of different functions, as far as I could tell from the literature so far. I think the reason why it might be important for speech is that it also controls respiration. And of course, when you're producing speech, at least when you're producing real speech, you need to control your breathing. So that's just what I'm thinking, and I haven't figured out completely what it means and what it does. So yeah, still ongoing on that.
Yeah, very interesting. You mentioned that you started with psychology and then you went into neurobiology and then already into neurotechnology. So obviously you needed to develop your technical skills along the way, and now coding is with Python is absolutely necessary now if you are working in neurotech. So how did this all happen? How did you acquire those technical skills? And maybe you have some recommendations for our listeners who are also coming from psychology and they want to get into neurotech.
Yeah. So technical skills, they're definitely invaluable. Although I do want to say that you don't necessarily need this technical background in order to make it in neurotechnology, right? So I had a psychology background, but a medical background, biological, anything really does give you a lot of kind of unique insight into a BCI team that you're working in. So that being said, I did have some programming courses in psychology already. I worked a bit with MATLAB back then, and I had developed a lot of programming skills during my internships, especially during internships. In my master's, I had 3 internships, so I had a lot of opportunity to learn. And it was mostly in MATLAB. So when I started in Maastricht, I had to learn Python for the first time. It's not that bad. It's a learning curve, but it's definitely doable because there are a load of resources out there on the internet, even free resources. So I think you have this website called Coursera that has a lot of courses, and specifically for machine learning at Python, there is scikit-learn, which is a package we use a lot, and they also provide courses. Also to learn more about machine learning itself and not only the coding part. There's also, I think, neuromatch.io for bigger courses, I think, for data analysis, programming, neuroscience in general. So those are some of the resources people might want to go to get more skills.
Thank you. And maybe you also can provide those links that you just mentioned, and we will add them into our podcast notes.
Yeah, so I just want to mention that I think the biggest way to learn is to go on internships, right? So at your bachelor's, at your master's, but even at the PhD level, I think you can go for internships and learn a lot. So if people are interested in our lab, we do always take students as well. So then they can go to our lab's page. It's neurointerfacinglab.github.io. So we'd be very happy to like show people around too.
Thank you so much. Thank you for mentioning that. That's very valuable. What do you think were your 3 main skills that allowed you to do this work that you have done?
Definitely data analysis. So statistics as well. That's often not often mentioned, but it's very important because you do have to validate your findings and make sure that they basically do a quality control on it. Yeah, I think programming is the second one. And the third is probably the psychology and neuroscience knowledge. Yeah, it's important to build your knowledge base besides the technical skills. For me specifically, because I work with patients, I think my psychology background was really a good fit for that because you have to be kind of flexible. You have to talk a lot with these patients, at least in the position that I am in. Of course, it depends how clinical position you go in, but it requires sometimes a lot of patience. So that's, I think, an important skill to have as well, flexibility.
Yeah, thank you so much. And what are your next career steps? What are your goals after finishing your PhD in neurotechnologies?
I'm exploring options a little bit. So currently, I'm doing a short internship at a neurotechnology company to get some knowledge on what that side is like, what industry is like, because of course, for my past career, I've only been in academia. So I was really curious on what it's like. So after my PhD, I for sure, I really love BCIs. So I would like to continue in this field, but I also really considering going back into the more psychological domain. So yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe you can help me with that, Milena.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we already had some conversation, yes, prior about that. I'm very curious now that you are having these internships at the neurotech company. What do you see as the main difference between academia and industry?
I think is kind of the goal. So in academia, we're at least in my lab, we have a clear goal, but we're very free in what to explore, where to go to generate ideas. And I think in a company, you have a slightly more set goal and products that you're actually working on to bring it to someone who needs it, or a client that's requesting something. So it's a different way of working. It's a bit more structured, I would say. And I kind of like that. You're working towards working with a clear purpose. Yeah. So it depends on what you want. That I guess you can also be flexible in this and the ways you approach this. But yeah, I guess that would be the big difference.
And if you would have any resources in the world, what would be the ideal project that you would like to do in neurotechnologies?
Oh, oh, that's a tough question. Considering my background in psychology and like society's problems, I think a BCI that would kind of help with like depression and anxiety, like stuff that the majority of the population is suffering from, would be great. I know there's work on this going on. I'm not sure on how well it's working yet. Maybe like with new technology and resources, we can get there. That would be the best thing, is to really have like the technology that can basically help any brain problem, right?
How do you see the field of neurotechnologies, maybe specifically for speech prosthesis 50, 60 years from now?
It's hard to predict because progress is going so fast. I think we will have the technology that's helping people that really need it. Definitely for people that are suffering from paralysis, that they are able to communicate again. Definitely, I think that will be solved by then. Luckily, in our consortium, we do have ethical branch as well. So I'm glad that's at least, yeah, our consortium is taking that into account. Yeah, I guess I would be a little bit scared of what's going to happen in the future.
So, what are your biggest ethical concerns about neurotechnologies?
There's, of course, the data privacy and being able to kind of potentially modify what people are thinking and doing. That's already happening a little bit, because the state-of-the-art BCIs are starting to implement large language models, and that's helping the BCI performance a lot. The downside of that is that it could potentially change the language that the person wants to use. So it could be semantically similar to what the person wants to say, but not the exact words. And slowly that can start to change how a person might be communicating, but then might be thinking themselves as well. I think there's some concern in how technology is going to be integrated with the individual and how they're going to adapt to it. Might also be the dependency on it. I know in the past there have been people implanted and then the company who provided this went bankrupt. But then there has been a big issue on what to do with the participant. So that's really something that should be thought about before anything happens.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And very legitimate concerns, and definitely they need to be addressed. So now we're getting to the most important part of this process. Yes, people are imagining that they're speaking. We can record that brain activity. And actually, by analyzing this brain activity, we can figure out what people were thinking about. So it looks like an actual mind reading. Can you tell us all about it? Is it mind reading or not?
Yes, this is a very important question. I think it's safe to say and important to say that speech decoding is not the same as reading your mind or reading your thoughts. We really think that what we are decoding is an attempt to speak, which is, you would imagine that it has a lot of motoric components. because when you're actually speaking or trying to speak, you're planning and activating a motor network. And this is what most speech BCIs, brain computer interfaces, actually use. They use these motoric features. They have their electrodes in the part of the brain that decodes motor movements. And that could also be movements of the mouth and articulators. And this is what you're decoding. But while you're just thinking during the day, your minds can go all over the place. You can, at least from what I'm thinking, is that this thinking is really abstract. It can be in words, it can be in visuals, it can be perceptions or sensations, like a smell or a touch. It could also be feelings. And you could switch between all of them all at once. At least in my mind, it's all not that clear. So I think that is a really important difference between just general thinking and decoding speech, the intent to speak. Another important distinction is that so right now we think it would only work if a person is actually intending to speak. That means that they would have control over the device, let's say. So if they did not intend to speak, probably we wouldn't be able to decode very well. So I think that's very important. If that were not the case, we would have some ethical issues.
Yes. Can you think of anything that you thought as impossible in your career up to now, in the research you did, that actually proved to be possible, or you proved it to be possible, and how did you do it?
So the biggest challenge was myself. During my master's, I was really at some point getting stuck, basically with my anxiety, with perfectionism, to a point that I thought, it's impossible. I cannot do this, and I'm not smart enough. So I had these thoughts or this idea that I'm not smart enough. To provide some context, I am the only one, the first and only one in my entire family that even went to university. So that got me thinking, oh, maybe we shouldn't be here or something like that. Yeah, to the point that I was so stuck that I handed in a bad version of my thesis. It's like, I can't do this anymore. And actually, at the point where I opened up to my supervisor about the struggle that I had and actually handing in that bad version, somehow my perspective started to change. I got into like an acceptance phase. Like, okay, there's nothing I can do about this now. Okay, let's so be it. And these thoughts started to dissipate a little bit, and I was able to then do it still. I was able to push through and finish that paper and actually hand in a good version. So yeah, I guess that's something I would pick, as that something that seemed impossible to me was possible in the end by changing my perspective. And I don't know, but I think a lot of people in academia might be having similar thoughts, and perfectionism seems to be very prevalent in this population. So I'd like to take the chance to give some advice on that. So there's something, this changing your perspective is a really powerful thing. And one way you can approach this is by thinking of all the kind of positive things and awesome things about having that anxiety or perfectionism. So that really worked for me, is to think, okay, what does it actually do? Maybe it is actually what got me this far in the first place, because if I didn't have that anxiety, I wouldn't have the desire to get where I am now. So maybe I wouldn't have gotten here at all if it wasn't for it, right? It's really can be a really powerful motivator. And it can also say something about you as a person that can be really cool. For example, it shows that I really care about what I'm doing, right? I really, really care about the work that I was doing and I'm doing now. and I want to do good in it. I want to do well, and I want to have integrity, or I care about integrity. So really to say things that are true and not to provide any false information, for example. And I think this process, it's called positive reframing, can already be very helpful to change your perspective and let go a little bit of the stress and keep going. There are a lot more really cool techniques. So if you want to learn more about that, I do have a book on that. It's called Feeling Great, and also a podcast called Feeling Good by Dr. David Burns. And he's one of the developers of cognitive behavioral therapy.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that and that advice. And definitely we will add these links to the book and to the podcast also in our podcast notes. We know that technologies are rapidly developing right now. There is so much that is done in neurotech. Yes, amazing companies who are working on invasive BCIs and non-invasive BCIs. What of these innovations in technologies inspire you? Where are you getting the inspiration for the work that you are doing?
I think my inspiration comes a lot from people. So from my peers, my colleagues, and the amazing work that everyone is doing. And also the participants themselves, the ones who are really working with these labs to work on the technology, right? It's so inspiring, these recent papers, and especially in the speech domain, I think that it's actually working. It's actually helping people communicate. And yeah, it's so awesome to see that it's actually starting to be useful. And I guess I would say a place that really inspires me is conferences. It's so great because you get to see everything new that's going on and actually talk to all of these people that are doing it. So every time I go, Society for Neuroscience, the BCI Society meeting, for example, oh, they're so great. They're so inspiring.
Mhm. And you also mentioned networking, and even you don't need even to mention because you show how networking really helped you to get to the place where you are right now. What would be your recommendations for networking to people who are in similar positions and also are paving their way in neurotech?
Yeah, definitely. Networking is key. So one thing you can do is those internships. Seek out the labs. Really do some search on what area it is that you want to go in, like that you feel a connection with, kind of. So you can choose a field, like a specific topic, or like a specific technology or a specific data analysis technique, or maybe more. And then find some labs that are doing really cool work, and you can just contact them, try to see if you can do an internship. I guess LinkedIn is a good resource to try to find some people, have a quick chat. I think if you approach people by saying like you want a job or something like that, it might be good, but it might also be better if you approach them in a way like, I'm super interested to learn more about what you're doing, and start asking them questions rather than telling them about yourself. Typically, I think that makes people more excited. They like to talk about the stuff they do, right? And if you have the chance to go to a conference, that's just amazing. But yeah, that might be a bit difficult. But maybe some local conferences in about something you're interested in. It's a great chance to meet people.
Yes, and thank you so much for mentioning about asking questions. Yes, that people like talking about the things they do. And I think this is one of your strongest skills that I noticed, asking questions. You do it a lot. And it's a wonderful way, first of all, to learn more in depth. Yes. And second of all, also establish connections with people, yes, networking. So Can you tell a little bit more about what drives you to ask questions? How did you find the questions to ask? How do you approach all this process? I'm sure now it's very natural, yes. But if somebody wants to start to ask questions, yes, how do you do it?
Oh, yeah. I was not always good at that because I was very shy. I guess it just comes from deeply wondering about what's going on, right? So if you're listening to something, I guess the way our brain works is you're always making predictions of what's going to come, right? And if something doesn't match what you're expected, that could be a question you might have, like, oh, why is that? I wasn't expecting that. And maybe that's something you can ask about. Yeah, maybe as a starter. I don't know.
Mhm. Yes, yeah, that's an excellent start. And also, you started talking about the conferences because at least one conference a year, is very feasible to participate in many cases. How do you approach the topic of networking during conferences? Do you approach people after their talk? Do you maybe make arrangements in advance? You already look who will be talking and you ask for a meeting. How do you do the networking? So my question is how to maximize, yes, the possibility to attend conference to get the best outcome from it, yes, in terms of networking and learning.
Yeah, for me, it really helped to be in the lab that I'm at and with my supervisor, Christian Herb, because he has a lot of contacts already. He's quite well known in the field, and that's awesome because he's able to introduce me to a lot of other people. But it happens kind of naturally as well during conferences. I think visiting posters that you're interested in and having a chat with that person presenting the poster, it's really great to meet those people. And if it's something really close to what you're doing, you might even ask for their contact information, or maybe there is a dinner organized or a lunch that you can go to together, or they can introduce you to the other people in their lab. There are sometimes socials organized during conferences. I think the best way if you're starting out is to really visit those posters and to like talk to those people, just ask the questions about the posters, and then maybe you can give some hints. Oh, I'm doing something similar, and I found this. What do you think about that? Something like that can really get the conversation started. I would also have some dinners planned with some people that haven't seen for a while, and go for a lunch together, talk about things, about research. Also, after talks, you can, if it's really interesting, you can then try to seek them out afterwards and have a chat, especially if it's too hard to ask a question during the talk, during the Q&A portion. It's very hard to ask questions when there's such a big audience and sometimes there's a long queue, so you don't even get to answer or get to ask your question. But yeah, I guess those are my tips a little bit.
Yeah, thank you so much. It has been a great pleasure talking to you. As we're nearing the end of our podcast, is there anything else you would like to share with our listeners or any piece of advice that you can give to them?
Yeah, I guess don't worry too much. If you're not sure on what you want to do, just listen to resources like this podcast, to generate some ideas, and then approach people and ask them some random questions to get a feeling of what it's like. And if you're getting stuck, really try to change your perspective on things. Try to see the positive sides on whatever you're struggling with right now, what it says about you. That's actually really awesome. Like the example I gave earlier. Um, yeah, I hope that might help.
Thank you very much, Maxim. Of course, I wish you all possible success in this amazing world of neurotechnologies, whatever you choose to do in the future, and of course with your career development. And I would love to record another podcast, maybe 5 years down the road, to see where you are at and to talk about all your new accomplishments. So thank you so much.
That would be great. Thank you so much. It was an honor to be here.
Dear Neurocareers podcast listeners, thank you for joining us on this incredible journey into the entrepreneurial world of neuroscience and neurotechnologies. I hope you've been inspired by the stories of those who are turning groundbreaking ideas into impactful realities. If you are looking for more guidance on succeeding in Neurocareers, book a free consultation with me, your podcast host, Dr. K, at the Institute of Neuroapproaches. So, what are you waiting for? Let's navigate the path to success in the world of Neurocareers and make the impossible possible together.